Hello, welcome back to the Tonic Accord podcast. My name is Drew. I'm accompanied by my co-host and good friend Alex. Um,
Hey, everybody.
this week we are going to be discussing term limits, not just in the sense of Congress, but also in the sense of judges, Supreme Court judges, as well as perhaps maybe even an age cap on presidential candidates. Because we're starting to find that the major Democratic candidates are pretty old. All four, I think, or five are over 70 years old. There's some questions about cognitive ability at that level. And, you know, if you had someone like Bernie Sanders, he would be probably the oldest president ever elected. So we're going to be discussing not just age limits, but also Supreme Court judges, term limits, and perhaps adjusting our rules and on our limits of who serves in office and for how long. So first off, Alex, how you doing, man? And what are your just kind of primary, like, first thoughts on the age of the candidates we're seeing and cognitive ability?
Hey, everybody. Yeah, Drew, I'm doing pretty well. Hope you are as well. I've been kind of sick this week, but like I was telling you, I've got out of the darkness, I guess. So on the amend. And yeah, off the bat, it's an interesting topic. When you messaged me about this a few days ago, it was something I'd never really thought about. But it is true that we are seeing some of the oldest presidential candidates that have ever ran. I mean, Donald Trump, if I'm correct, I think is the oldest president to ever be elected. I think he was 70 when he was elected, right? And so it is interesting to see this trend. And, you know, for me, I guess first things first, I kind of am torn on it because when I was doing research for this, almost every article that came up from the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal to the Washington Post and Forbes all basically said it's BS to question the age and the suitability to be president. And maybe so. I mean, obviously, no one's the same when it comes to your age and your mental cognitive ability. But at the same time, I mean, it's just true that the older you get, a lot of things do slowly become compromised. And obviously, people are healthier and living longer than ever before. But then at the same time, I do have to wonder if there is a point where maybe you are too old to deal with the stress. I mean, there are so many presidential memoirs out there that just talk about how difficult a job it is. And I just want to quote President Jimmy Carter about this. He's 94 years old right now. And he's been someone to actually criticize the age that have come out. And he said that he personally doesn't think that he would have been able to do the job at the age of 80 or something. He wouldn't have been able to do it because he talks about it's not just, you know, getting information and making decisions, but it's analyzing information and making decisions on the spot. And he just personally doesn't think that someone at that old of an age could do it. So what do you think?
Yeah, again, you know, everyone ages differently, right? You know, and cognitive ability is not just attached to a number alone. It's a plethora of things, and, you know, everyone ages differently. But it is concerning when you have someone, you know, Jimmy Carter's who's 95 now, said that, you know, when you're a president, you have to be, his quotes, very flexible with one's mind. And he's, you know, and he went, like you mentioned, he said at 80, he doesn't feel like he would have been flexible with his mind enough to do the job effectively. You know, and that's interesting because there's an old adage that I've heard that is whatever a man thinks at 35, he thinks for the rest of his life. You know, it's kind of like saying, like, when people are younger, they're more open-minded, more willing to hear new things. But by the time we're middle-aged-ish, you're pretty much set in your ways. That's obviously not the case for everyone, but it's an old adage because there's some truth to it, right? I mean, I think older people, for whatever reasons, are just kind of, you know, they've seen enough to where they believe, well, I've seen enough evidence to believe what I currently believe, and that's kind of that. And I think that Jimmy Carter his saying is, look, to be president, you have to keep an open mind because you're gonna probably come across a plethora of problems you hadn't thought before, and you might not have experienced something similar earlier in your life. You have to keep somewhat of an open mind. So it is worth it's worth, like, for example, someone like Joe Biden, who is in his 70s. He's having a hard time connecting with the youth because I think he's so set in his ways from the past, and he's, kind of an old guard Democrat. Now, what's interesting is how Bernie Sanders is also very old and is connecting with the youth. But that's also because he's been so set in his progressive agenda for so long, right? Like Bernie Sanders hasn't changed his opinions on things for 30 years. Whether or not you agree with him, he's also pretty set in his ways. So it's interesting that like we might have to consider, well, do we want someone with a more open mind to come across challenges, and maybe not someone that's in their late 70s that feels like they've seen everything when they might not have.
I mean, yeah, no, I think that's a fair point, and it does draw a stark contrast between a Joe Biden and a Bernie Sanders. But I do want to kind of provide you with a hypothetical to kind of go off of that. Is I don't know if I completely agree with Jimmy Carter's quote that it takes a flexible mind, because would you tell me that you think that Pete Buttigieg is more flexible when it comes to policy than someone like Joe Biden? Because I would actually probably say no. I think there's a difference between being old and set in your ways and being politically flexible. I mean, let's be honest, Trump might be one of the most politically flexible people of our lifetime. And he is in his 70s. I mean, he has flip-flopped so often on views that I don't think many people knows what he truly stands for. And so I think it's go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I don't think that flip-flopping on one ideals for political gain is different than having an open mind when it comes to addressing problems with multiple solutions. I think there's a difference.
That's fair.
I think there's a difference between when Carter says be flexible with one mind than being I'm going to completely change what I've said just to whatever pleases the people now. Like there's a difference between those two concepts.
Yeah, but I would take it back a little bit. I think there's a lot of background and history during the Obama administration and the George W. Bush administration that would say neither one of those men were flexible when it came to working with the other side, for example. And so that's where my point is that I don't know if you're 45 or 75. I don't know if it really makes the point of you being more or less flexible. I think it just means that maybe you're more set. I mean, Joe Biden, honestly, I mean, he's been known as actually someone that has been able to be open-minded, and he's 75. But then I mean, there's a lot of times where Obama, who was much younger, was not as flexible and open-minded on things. Obviously, he dealt with a lot of other factors, but I just don't know if open and flexible is even really possible anymore, either young or old, is more my point, I guess.
That could be true as well, that we could be such in like a deeply, entrenched political culture that even if one is open-minded on the inside, that on the outside you have to kind of play ball play for your team or whatever. That could be very true, and that, we've talked about that many times about how deeply entrenched our political landscape is. But I also think that thinking about the elephant in the room is just base cognitive ability as well. I mean, Ronald Reagan had an example of this, that he was elected at 73, and we both read in this Atlantic article, they talked about how by the end of his second term, some people were seeing signs of his Alzheimer's disease that he would announce 5 years later, but it was beginning then. It's right. Of course it's not comfortable. It's not a comfortable conversation to have with anyone, and it's kind of and of course we talk about everyone ages differently, but it's worth at least addressing when some of these guys are getting into their late 70s, and if they're elected, right, you assume at least 4 years. If Bernie Sanders gets elected, he'd be in his 80s, in his for term. When do we ask the question? Well, how good is your mind? Like, do we have to do a test or something? Like, I think there has to be somewhat of a limit of where we draw the line because of health issues and cognitive ability. I mean, Bernie Sanders had a heart attack on his campaign. Now he had stents put in, and he says he feels better than ever, but the man, he still had a heart attack on his campaign trail. That's not really a good sign.
No, it's a very fair point. And I think it's interesting you bring up Reagan, because this is a source. It's not really related to politics, but there's a book I just finished reading called Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker, and it's a really fascinating book for anyone out there who wants a fascinating read outside of politics. But Matthew Walker uses the example of Reagan and Margaret Thatcher as two people that eventually had brain degenerative disorders. And he basically says it's because of this lack of sleep that might have just caused this to be expedited during the time as being a leader, because you're not sleeping, your schedule is chaotic, and you're just going through a whirlwind of decisions, emotion, jet lag, and his argument is that Reagan's maybe he probably already had onset issues that would lead eventually to Alzheimer's, but being a leader for 2 terms probably made it worse, you know. And so to your point, I mean, yeah, I think it is a difficult topic, but we do need to kind of say, is this person someone that we could see going out 2 terms and being well? And, you know, on your point with Bernie Sanders, it's true. He may say he's feeling the best he's ever felt, but he did have a heart attack. And I mean, Trump and Bernie to me are two that on the public, like at their rallies and their speeches, they seem like the most energized in the room. And, you know, Trump hasn't been honest about his health records, even though he said he's in perfect health, and Bernie said I'm feeling excellent. But I think you're right. There does need to be some form of a test on cognitive ability, because you can say one thing, but everyone seems to have some sort of preset or genetic issues that eventually come out.
Yeah. And and to the point about energy, right? Like, Joe Biden's had low energy, but energy doesn't necessarily, energy can also be high energy, but you can be rambling. We see that with Trump's rallies where he has high energy, but man, he goes off on some strange tangents that, are kind of like, okay, grandpa, whatever you say, grandpa, that kind of stuff. So when we're talking about this conversation, right? And if you're out there listening and you're thinking, look, like this kind of sounds like ageism, let's not forget that the entire presidential candidacy process is ageist in a sense that you have to be at least 35, right? There is a minimum amount of age requirement. So we've decided that we don't trust young people enough to be president. So then I don't see how it's that far of a stretch to then think about, well, the other side, maybe there should be a cap on the age. Because again, like there's already a limit on age. So the process itself is ageist. And it's just okay, and we've decided that maybe for good reason. Maybe someone under 35 has not had the life experience enough to understand complex problems. Perhaps, I mean that seems to be agreed upon because that's what we all adhere to. So I think it's perfectly reasonable then to address maybe you can't be a candidate, you can't become a new candidate for presidency at 75, 70. I don't know where to draw the line, but if you drew the line at 70, you would have. You would only have what? Klobuchar and Buttigieg?
No, it's true. That's true. But I do think, like, you're right, is that we do kind of need to put, I guess you could say, parameters on it, because it's true that if you're going to say you have to be 35 years old, then why not say, yes, you need to do this, which is tough. And one of the counter arguments I've heard, which came out of Forbes, was Juliet, one of the authors in it, argued that the rigors of campaigning are a good screen for the bottom line qualifications necessary to be president. Weathering a presidential campaign proves the contestant has far better health and stamina than anyone of any age hasn't done it. A presidential candidate should be judged on verbal agility, reasoning power, historical knowledge, and the vision of the common good. And I do agree, I think we've both already talked about this, that energy doesn't always mean health, right? But it is true that I think it comes down to, there is some reason in this, is that if you're on the campaign trail for 2 years and you really do show a diligent and responsive way of speaking, and it does seem that you're, on your toes at all times, I do think it's a good judge of your mental awareness, and that goes back to Trump's ramblings. Is yes, he's energetic, but you're right, he does sound like he's gone a little bit off.
Yeah, I mean that's true, right? I can see that as well. How because I from all we know from documentaries and understanding politics, that the campaign trail is brutal. It's rigorous. I mean, you're literally traveling across, and politicians will brag about it. I visited 136 cities in 100 days, right? Like that's got to be insane, like that's got to be insane. And back to what you said about like just health wise, what sleep happens. It's generally understood that your first night in a new room where you sleep is your mind is like half awake. It's not, you don't get like a full REM cycle because it's about, it's a defensive mechanism, right? You're in a new room, your body's on edge because you don't understand what's around you. So you don't nearly sleep as well your first night in a new place. And imagine if you're doing a new place every night for 100 days, you're not getting correct sleep. So I can see how that would be a screener, but it seems like it seems like you can kind of balance it out if you are energetic enough. Like for example, if you do have the common good in mind, you have a clear message, and you are good at speaking. you can kind of hide your health problems. Like Bernie Sanders is, I think, good in those three areas, along with the people that go to his rallies. But he also had a heart attack. Hillary Clinton was collapsing during her campaign trail in 2016. But she was able to, be poised enough during debates, right, to make it look like she was like, a regular politician and candidate in good health, even though she didn't win. But so I think that especially like there's some kind of not like full on cover ups, but you can kind of hide your health issues as long as you're good in those other areas.
True, but I mean, it's also true. This is nothing new, I mean, obviously age is different and people are older than before, but I mean, just two examples. FDR, no one knew he had polio at the time.
Yeah.
When he was president, I mean, they pretty much manufactured all of his public speeches and televised speeches where it looked like he was just, behind a desk or behind some cover, and no one really knew, like the general public did not know the health issues that he'd suffered from. And it was the same with JFK. I mean, he was a crippled man. He was taking so many drugs because of his different spinal issues. The man could barely walk by the time he was 30. And so I just don't know, is that I guess if you can somewhat maintain this public persona and still make effective decisions, it is true that you have people around you that are going to be supportive of you. And I think as long as it's only physical decline that is not detrimental and it's not mental decline, then who says you can't do it,
Oh, absolutely. And that's a very good point. That's a very good distinction you just made, that it's not physical decline. If someone's in a wheelchair, that has no bearing on their policy decisions. But I think it is worth saying though, then yes, but mental decline, we do have to take a look at, because you don't want someone that's locked in for another 3-4 years to be in mental decline, making decisions that affect hundreds of millions of people.
Right.
So, I mean, yeah, the JFK one's interesting too, because he was definitely just drugged out, because of his severe health problems. But then he's also considered a great president. It's tough, and it's not an easy conversation. And again, I don't know where to draw the line, right? It's not like, 75, that's it, and that'll just solve all the problems. Like, I'm not sure that's the answer, but I think it is at least worth asking. How can we expect someone like Bernie Sanders to have the mental capacity, not capacity, but mental cognition to last 8 years into his mid 80s with this? That's a tough question.
No, and I think that is at the end of the day, the kind of alarming part about it is that also the older you get, the quicker the decline is once there is a decline, and it's true is that when you first told me that, because I guess I just never really thought about it, that yes, he is going, like, say first he gets elected, which I don't think is going to happen first off, but hypothetically, yes, if he gets elected and then gets reelected, he's going to be quite an old man. And money can buy you certain extents of better health precautions, but it's not going to save you. And there is the 25th Amendment, which in 1967, I think it was put in to do on, what is it? I think removing a president from office if they're deemed unfit for service, which is always there as a safety net. But I honestly feel like in this just hyper news cycle and hyper partisan world we live in, that I could honestly never really see the 25th Amendment being enacted, because political opponents and political rivals would just call it as a political apparatus to get rid of the president. You know what I mean?
Right. I think you'd have to have like a pretty obvious mental decline. Like, like it wouldn't be something like Trump. Like, Trump rambles and half the country thinks he's dumb and the other half the country thinks he shoots from the hip. I think you would have to have something way more extreme where it would be like the person cannot even make a full sentence, right? Like that would be the way you're like, okay, we have to invoke the 25th. But that's such an extreme that we haven't seen before. And so I think you're right. I think generally you're right that I don't think it would happen anytime soon. I think it would have to be an extreme case of like, this guy's over the hill,
Yeah.
I hate to put it bluntly, but yeah, you're right. I think it's probably pretty rare that's going to happen. I want to kind of shift gears a little bit too. Is instead of just kind of cognitive ability and age, I also want to talk a little bit about term limits in the United States. And I'm not talking about, the 2-year congressional term or the 6-year Senate term. I'm talking about like a cap on the amount of terms you can have, right? So you would not be able to be a career politician. You would only be able to serve 3 terms as Congress or 2 terms as a senator, and then you would have to move jobs. This is an idea that gets floated around ever so often, especially now that we do have long-term politicians, right, like Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell, that they've been in their jobs for decades and decades. They are kind of staples of American politics at this point. Is that a good thing? Is it good to have politicians that are that established in their careers, or should we cut them off? And we'll go into a little bit of a couple examples of where this came into case law, but I just wanted to start with that. Alex, what do you think? Should there be an overall cap on limits for congressional and senators?
Okay, so for me, this is a complicated issue that I kind of go back and forth on. I think in theory, term limits are a good idea. And amongst most voting Americans, it's a popular idea. Getting new blood into an old system could be seen as positive and progressive, right? And probably in a perfect world, I would agree. But it's interesting. Actually, over time, I've kind of started to believe that I don't favor term limits in the legislature. When it comes to the president, I think people think that because the president has term limits, that it's a good idea to also have term limits on the legislator. And I'm not talking about the judiciary right now, just the legislator. And I honestly think that there is a reason why, if you look out most of the world, there are not term limits on the legislator. It's actually hard to find a lot of like large comparative studies on this, but I was looking over Europe, Asia, and Latin America, and pretty much unanimously, every single one has legislatures with unlimited term limits.
Yeah.
And I read an interesting article in the Brookings Institute that gave 5 reasons against term limits. And if you bear with me really fast, I'll just give you the highlight of each one. One, it says that it takes away power from voters. And I think this is interesting because basically, say voters really like a candidate who has been there for a long time, they lose their ability to vote for this person if this person passes their term limit cap. The second one is it severely decreases congressional capacity because instead of continuing on with long-term plans and working with experts that have been there for years, you're constantly having new blood and new people that need, assistance and to learn the system, which can be good but can also be bad. Third is that it limits incentives for gaining policy expertise, which kind of goes back to what the above one is. Fourth, it automatically kicks out effective lawmakers. And fifth, and this is, I think, the most important one, is it actually does little to minimize corruptive behavior. And the example is that lobbyists. Basically, the argument is that if that a lot of long-term politicians are attached to lobbyists, right? So the idea is that if you get rid of them, then the lobbyists will be diminished. But actually, it's an interesting argument, but people say that if you bring in newcomers a lot, they don't have as much expertise in these areas, and they're actually going to rely on outside influence, which are lobbyists. So it almost creates more of a circle of, okay, well, I've only been here and I need help on learning how to work this system. So I'm going to talk to people that have done it before in the term of lobbyists. And examples of this are all over the place. But in Mexico, for example, they've had term limits, and it's actually been very negative, where basically because of the term limits, the Congress is basically linked to the power of the president. And so in many ways, whoever the president is, the Congress also votes and acts alongside him. There's no outlasting the president and no independence. There's just the executive and the legislature tied up. So sorry, that's long, but that's my view on term limits.
No, that's an excellent argument. I hear that a lot too about the expertise you gain over time and the experience, and like some of these understanding our institutions and our government can take decades to fully grasp and kind of understand how to utilize in legislation. And so that definitely is a concern. I think in this conversation, it doesn't matter what kind of number we're talking about, because if it was like you can only serve 8 years as a congressman and 6 years as a senator, I would absolutely agree with you. That's just not enough time. You would be recycling people in and out. You would exacerbate the revolving door of politicians and lobbyists, right? Because even today, when incumbents feel like they want to retire, or maybe they lose their seat in changing demographics, they'll come back as a lobbyist, and because they already know everybody there. And so I feel like, filtering them out quicker would just make that revolving door worse. But I think that maybe a longer kind of term, like 24 years, or 18 years as a senator, that could be kind of a middle ground where you have enough years, 18, 20 years of expertise. You can kind of get to know people and understand the functions of government. You can represent your constituency for a good amount of time. But then you can also avoid the issues where you have people that are so entrenched and they've gerrymandered their districts so that they've been entrenched for decades. They don't really need to be in tune with the public anymore. The whole conversation about cognitive ability comes back in again when you start getting, Nancy Pelosi at 80. Now she's very sharp. A lot of people agree she's pretty sharp and on her toes still, but that question still comes up. And I'm kind of torn as well, right? Because I think I'm also very used to what we have now, and you have these such strong political figures that are because of their lack of term limits. But I don't know. I also think that the way our politics is set up is because of stuff like gerrymandering, incumbent advantages in elections. It's very easy that you could have someone that's less than ideal become a congressman or woman for 50 years that may not truly represent what their people think.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point too. I think you did a good job there of breaking down the terms because, yeah, I broadly just said I don't like term limits, and it's true. Like, yeah, 6, like basically if a senator was only limited to 1 or 2 terms and a congressman as well, then yeah, I think it's just pointless because, like you said, the revolving door is just going to get exasperated. But then that's an interesting point is maybe do you hold it to an 18-year or a 24-year term or something in that scope? Because it's true. During that time, that is almost equivalent to a career at a company right there. That is almost the same amount of time you would spend with one company. And that's always the argument I hear is that short-term limits are pointless because if you work for a company for 20 years, no one questions that. And it gives you time to really move up the ladder and learn your position. But at the same time, I think what you said is that A, we are used to this, and so we don't really know anything else. And B, is that sometimes the interests of these people do get convoluted or just downright sinister, or not even sinister, but just corrupted as time goes on, And that Atlantic article that we both were talking about earlier has a point that the average senator is 62, and Mitch McConnell, who is 77, is already past the U.S. male life expectancy. And if the country were to say the Social Security retirement of 66 is the mandatory cutoff for a career in politics, basically there would be an overhaul of the whole government.
Right.
So that is a little bit ridiculous, especially because baby boomers are getting older and the demographics are changing. And you do have to wonder, though, is it worth overhauling the system or working within the system? And I think that comes to a lot of the discussions we're having all through politics right now. But is it worth doing this change in term limits or just hoping that maybe fresh blood is coming? And I don't know. Again, I'm torn.
I also think there's a like an institutional problem because, right, we're talking about limits on the legislator, and the only way to do that would be enacted by law, and who makes the laws but the legislators. So I think even if this is something that's popular among the American people, it's going to be incredibly difficult to convince the people to write their own basically firing, right? Why would they vote in favor of limiting their own career? So you kind of have that issue, and I don't know. That's going to be tough to break, right? Because people don't want to give up power so willingly, even if they might, campaign on it or tell people, yeah, it's a popular idea, and I'll bring it to the floor. They know it's going to be dead, and they're just kind of doing lip service to look good. I know it sounds cynical, but I really think that's one of the main reasons that we'll never see kind of a cap on term limits is because the legislator would be voting for their own firing.
That's that's a very good point. That is a very good point. The one thing though, like the last criticism I have for term limits, because I do agree with you, is that I think something does probably need to be changed. And it's true that, I mean, I don't really know if a bunch of people that, I mean, most like this is not trying to be ageist either, but most people I know that are in their 70s or 80s are retired,
Right.
right? Not still making laws that govern people that are half their age. And so that's one reason why I do think maybe there does need to be some form of a term limit, maybe over maybe 2 decades, something where you have time to get things accomplished, but not too long to overwear your welcome. But the other thing I was going to say is the one critique of term limits, which comes from the president as well, but also could be an example of what could happen in the legislative branch, is something that is called the last term issue, which is where the office holder's last term causes them to do controversial moves. You saw this with, I think, President Adams in probably about 1800 when he loaded the courts, and eventually that put forward Marbury versus Madison. And then you also saw this with Bill Clinton when he got a lot of flack for giving out pardons on his last day of office. And currently, you could probably see this happening more and more with Trump, as we've already seen this week, is that basically, if you know you're getting close to a cliff or the end of the road, you're going to start doing things that maybe are brash. And so that goes back to maybe the long run is better, but there does need to be a cap on that long run. So, yeah.
Yeah, again, we would, I think a deeper discussion we have to go into like the actual numbers, but I do think it's worth perhaps having some kind of limit, so that it's not just the goal of one person's life to become a politician the entire time. I think that having experience out in the quote unquote real world, and having other incentives other than just being in Washington can be beneficial to how people legislate. But what those numbers are, again, that's a kind of a tougher discussion. But you bring up very good points about why we might not have term limits. But I want to now switch it again a little bit more before we end this discussion to the judiciary. Do you think that term limits on Supreme Court appointments would be beneficial?
So if we did basically a scale from 0 to 3 on term limits, where you have the president at 3, with where I say yes, there's term limits, and where I say no at 0 for the legislative branch, I really put the judiciary in the middle, because it is such a gray area and the Constitution is so weak at defining this. Like,
Right.
It basically says that they will stay during good behavior.
Yeah, whatever good
Like,
behavior
what the hell
means.
does that mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, like, and so this is so difficult for me. Like, I watched those videos you sent, and I was reading a little about it too, and I just don't really know. And I get the argument is that basically, and it's kind of the similar argument to legislators, is that would you outlive a president or a party or an administration? Maybe it brings down the partisan decisions. What do you think? Because I don't know, man, it's tough.
Right. Well, I definitely think that, first off, just to kind of clear the air, like I don't think that the judiciary should be elected, right? I think they should be outside of the electoral process to avoid the whims of a pretty pendulum swinging voting populace. So they shouldn't be.
Agreed.
That should not be the solution. But I do think there should be a limit. Again, into like a second decade, right? Like a 20 years. I mean, because it used to be, right? It used to be in the early parts of the country that Supreme Court nominees would go for about 15 years. Life expectancy was shorter. More people were willing to just retire when they felt they would need. But now we're getting Supreme Court justices lasting an average of 23 years since the 70s. That's a long time. And so perhaps, something like a more originally planned, like a 14 or 16 year limit, would prevent against, court stacking. I think that's the biggest problem. Is it's less about, I understand that the idea of the judiciary is to be less wavering in like populist, movements, and more of a rock and a structure that we can look to. Right. But I also think that court stacking has become such a main problem, and it's even known that Supreme Court justices will wait to retire until they know that they can be replaced by something ideologically close to them, right?
Yeah.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg is probably going to retire if a Democrat gets elected in the next election. That's just a guess, but right. But Scalia did the same thing, where he wanted to make sure that he was replaced by a conservative. Doesn't matter which side, both do it. But it's concerning when it becomes less about the honor of protecting the Constitution and how you interpret it, and more about how can I keep our court stacked for my team. And this whole life appointment thing. It's like if you get it at the right time, right, like Trump with Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. Then now Trump has an influence for the next 30 years over the courts. I mean, Trump's going to be dead, but before his court appointments are even in their late 70s, right? Kavanaugh's in his mid 50s, I think, and so if he goes for another 25 years, right, that's a long time.
That's very true.
Yeah, I think I kind of agree with you that there has to be a middle ground, right? Because we can't just have it be quick ins and outs, and then we'll just be too affected by the whims of the wind. But you do need to prevent against long-term 30-year court stacking just based off of who happens to be president at the time.
Right. And I think that's an amazing analysis right there, and it's true. And I mean, as we saw with Merrick Garland after the death of Scalia, I think that was one of the events that has hyper-partisanized or made more hyper-partisan. I don't know if that's a word. So, but I think that kind of kick-started this process even worse. But it's true. I mean, the reason why I think a lot of conservatives have stuck with Trump is because he's been able to load this court. And I mean, let's be completely honest, is that the argument is that the longer these stay, they outlive administrations and ideologies. But humans by nature, we are tribal partisan creatures at the end of the day. And yes, there's a few justices over the years that have gone more moderate than they were not elected, but appointed to be. I mean, you have Justice Roberts right now, who I would argue in certain ways actually has been more of a centrist than a lot of people imagined. But then at the same time, you have justices like Clarence Thomas right now, who kind of pick and choose what they believe is free speech and human rights based on the ideology that guides it. And I don't think that time is going to change a lot of these people's views. That's my point at the end of the day, is that I don't know if unlimited terms is going to make this person be some arbiter of truth.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I just think that you're right. There does need to be somewhat of a middle ground between no term limits and a 2-term limit or a 10-year limit or whatnot, because people change.
Scalia had an interesting, and again, I want to clarify that when I mentioned that Scalia had planned to retire and be replaced by a Republican. He passed away, and then they had the whole Merrick Garland situation and all that. But he had written down that that was his plan, right? So that's a known thing for other Supreme Court justices. Anyway, back to Scalia. He also had an interesting kind of not just analysis, but he had an interesting analysis of it. He basically said that you have 9 lawyers that are for life deciding the fates of many Americans, and he mentioned how it could easily be very out of touch, right? I mean, like 9 lawyers have more say on what happens with the United States government than any the Congress or the president, right? You can argue that the judiciary makes some of the biggest decisions in American history, right? Constitutional amendments, Roe versus Wade, some of the biggest things that still today we debate happen out of the judiciary. And if it comes down to 9 people at the time, I mean that alone is like, well, that's such a small amount of people to decide such large things. So even within the judiciary, they had their own concerns for the structure of how it was made.
Right. And that's a fair point to touch on, and I think there's 2 levels to that. First is the more negative one, the more pessimistic one, is that in order to adopt term limits, it would have to be through a constitutional provision.
Right.
And so that would have to be through an amendment. And that would be through obtaining a House and Senate supermajority. And first off, that's just not going to happen. That's just not going to happen right now, unless there was, a big change of heart or the public opinion or something big. And the second one is, I think the more optimistic side of it is that, yes, like you said, I think it's a fair point to say that these are 9 lawyers making decisions for Americans. And that's a fair point, but a lot of cases don't get to the Supreme Court.
That's true.
Right. Like we do have a lot of lower courts that deal with these issues as well. And yes, like the biggest issues at the time, gay marriage, abortion, these forms of issues, yes, those are huge. And yes, if you have a packed court on one side, like for example, the Republicans were in the minority in voting for Trump, though they won the Electoral College. But now the court is a majority Republican. We can debate all day the fairness of that, but at the end of the day, a lot of these issues luckily don't make it up to that point. And so I do think there are filter down effects that do limit sometimes the Supreme Court's power. And that's why we do have this system of checks and balances. But I think right now, as we're seeing through Trump's actions in the executive and the division in the Congress and these Supreme Court issues, is that our checks and balances are being tested at their core.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so that's why we bring up this discussion about term limits. And why it kind of comes back around every so often, because it's an interesting topic, and I find it very fascinating. All right, that will conclude this episode of the Tonic Accord. Let us know your thoughts. Do you think there should be a cap on terms for congressmen, senators, judiciary? Age, does age play a role in how you vote or where you find your political leanings lie? Let us know in the comments, and as always, thank you for listening.